Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. This week we look into the history of the Temple Mount, the current conflict that is raging, and who is really being discriminated against. Let's get started.
At 9:45 a.m., Colonel Mota Gore breached Lion's Gate, and at 10 a.m., his voice crackled through the army radio, shouting ecstatic words that still ring in Israel's memory. The Temple Mount is in our hands. Minutes later, IDF Chief Rabbi Shlomo Goren arrived to recite the poignant Shehechi Yanu blessing and to sound the shofar as emotional paratroopers wept and smiled at the ancient stones of the newly liberated wall.
That was reliving the moments of June 7th, 1967, thanks to the Jewish Learning Institute's Battle for Jerusalem. In the year 1967, a war had just broken out between Israel and its many Arab neighbors, aimed at the destruction of the new state. The Israeli army achieved much more than they had ever imagined. On June 7, 1967, the Israeli army recaptured the old city of Jerusalem that had been held by the Jordanians. As we just heard in that clip, for the first time, Jewish soldiers and paratroopers were able to pray at the Western Wall, finally putting an end to the centuries-old ban stopping Jews from praying at their holiest site. For the first time in centuries, the Jewish Temple Mount, the holiest site to Jews, was finally under Jewish control. However, this was not going to last very long. Even though some religious zealots amongst the soldiers considered holding or even destroying the Islamic shrines atop the Temple Mount, that is not what happened. As an Atlantic article describes, it is, in retrospect, an astonishing moment of religious restraint. The Jewish people had just returned to their holiest site from which they had been denied access for centuries, only to effectively yield sovereignty at this moment of triumph. Shortly after the war, Moshe Dayan met with officials from the Muslim Waqf, who governed the holy site, and formally returned the mount to their control. While Israeli soldiers would determine security and stand at the gates, the Waqf would determine who would pray at this site, an arrangement that would effectively bar non-Muslim prayer. This has been the so-called status quo in the city of Jerusalem. The idea and agreements between the Israeli government and the various religious authorities in the area, effectively ensuring that all religious groups have the ability to visit and maintain their holy sites. Moshe Dayan, the man who gave back the Temple Mount, was hoping that this would quell any type of fears about a future holy war between the Jews and the Muslims over the Temple Mount. This is how things have remained in Jerusalem since 1967, or really has it? When we come back, we're going to talk about the changes to the supposed status quo over the last number of years and how they've affected all of the people living in the neighborhood. We'll be right back on the Jewish Diaspora Report right after this. Since 1967, the Temple Mount, or the Al-Haram al-Sharif, have been under the control of the Muslim authority known as the Waqf. In what is known as A Brief Guide to the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Haram al-Sharif, published by the Waqf, providing students and tourists with information on the holy site, it says, quote, "The two principal edifices are the Dome of the Rock on the raised platform in the middle and the Mosque of Al-Aqsa against the southern wall," end quote. It continues to say the site's, quote, "sanctity dates to the earliest times. Its identity with the site of Solomon's temple is beyond dispute. This too is the spot, according to universal belief, on which David built the altar to the Lord," end quote. This, of course, was quoting the Hebrew Bible's 2 Samuel 24. It may seem like common sense to some, but in 1967 it was not a controversial statement to make. So why now have things changed so much, and why is it controversial to suggest that it could be both the Al-Haram al-Sharif and the Temple Mount? According to an article in the Jerusalem Post, there has not been a steady and continuous status quo on the Mount since the Israeli victory in June 1967. Rather, there has been a constant change in the status quo from the Arab-Muslim side, and a continuous erosion and retreat of Jewish presence and rights, aided and mistakenly abetted by the chief rabbinate and Israeli police in their quest to maintain what they define as properly religious behavior and public order. From 1967 until September 2000, Jews went up freely to the Temple Mount with their prayer books and prayed silently at will, with no police checks and no Waqf employee following them. But today, no rabbinical group can come and pray in the Mount. Today's police status quo has limited Jews to being allowed to walk on the Mount, a definite change in the status quo. Non-Muslims are also restricted from which entrances they can use and what times of day they are allowed to attend the Temple Mount. The next major status quo change came in September 2000 when the soon-to-be Prime Minister Ariel Sharon visited the Temple Mount with police as a political statement as a part of his campaign. Planned rioting broke out again, serving as the now acknowledged pretext for the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat's launch of the pre-planned Second Intifada. Police then created a new status quo after this visit and closed the mount to Jewish visitors until 2003. Since 2003, in a major change of the status quo, Israeli police set up checks for Jews in religious dress and checked their bags before entering the Temple Mount, ensuring removal of all prayer books prior to entering the mount. An overzealous policeman recently even asked a young tourist to take off his kippah so as to not offend the Muslim sensibilities. This is definitely not the previous status quo. We can see the slow deterioration of Jewish rights on the Temple Mount and the ability to visit at certain times, what they're allowed to bring, what they're allowed to do. This definitely does not seem like the initial plan of the status quo agreement for all religions and peoples to be able to visit their holy sites in freedom and peace. I wonder if the Israeli government and Moshe Dayan would have happily given over the Temple Mount after capturing it in 1967 had they known what would eventually come of it. Would it have been better to keep it under Israeli control like many other sites like the Western Wall that is open to everybody around the world, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that people from every faith can visit? The Temple Mount, under the control of the Waqf, unfortunately is probably the most restricted area where others can only go at certain times and do certain things according to their rules. We'll see in a moment the current situation in Jerusalem when we come back on the Jewish Diaspora Report. Stay with us. In a video posted to YouTube by travelingisrael.com called Discrimination Against Jews and Christians in Jerusalem, an Israeli tour guide shows his inability as a Jewish person to visit the Temple Mount. As a non-Muslim, he goes to different gates and shows how he's turned away by Israeli police. He explains that if he doesn't look Muslim, he has to prove that he is Muslim. He could do this by speaking in Arabic or saying a few prayers. If he proves he's Muslim, he can use any gate he likes. He then goes to the one gate that he is allowed to go as a non-Muslim person and shows the process of being searched for any type of religious items that are barred from the premises. He, of course, points out that this is not an issue by the Israeli police. They're just simply doing their job. It is the policies that are in place by the Israeli government and the Israeli police that try and restrict Jewish movement on the Temple Mount in order to appease the Muslim and Palestinian people. In a recent CNN report, in an effort to reduce tensions and in line with similar Israeli government decisions in recent years, from April 21st, there will be no further visits by any Jewish groups until the end of Ramadan. For 10 days, Jewish people are restricted from reaching the Temple Mount. Also this week in the Times of Israel, they report that due to the current violence at the Temple Mount, the Israeli police will bar non-Muslims from visiting the temple and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The plan was leaked to a number of Hebrew media outlets on Tuesday evening, sparking immediate outcry from right-wing lawmakers and pundits who blasted the government for caving to terror. Following the days of clashes between Palestinians and Israeli police on the Temple Mount, the policy of barring non-Muslims from visiting the Temple Mount during the last roughly 10 days of Ramadan has been in place for years, however. Last year, former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu ordered the site closed for non-Muslims for 19 days during Ramadan. He came under heavy criticism when he barred the site from reopening to Jewish worshippers on Jerusalem Day, a nationalist holiday celebrating Israel taking control of the capital in 1967, which coincided with Ramadan. His government said that the move was evidence that he was committed to maintaining calm as tensions spiked in Jerusalem, eventually leading to an 11-day war with terrorists in Gaza. By now, we've probably all seen the scenes from the Temple Mount where you have people throwing rocks and shooting off fireworks and police trying to maintain order and on occasion even, unfortunately, hitting people who are protesting. It seems like at this point the Palestinians are using force and starting to cause trouble with rock throwing and shooting off fireworks at civilians in order to get the Israeli government to restrict Jews from further abilities on the Temple Mount. It seems to work in their favor over the last number of years. The more they fight and the more problems that happen, the more the Jews are punished. Many videos have actually surfaced of Palestinians and Arab Israelis who are actually trying to fight against the protesters who are interrupting their prayers. Many people who go to the Temple Mount or the Al-Haram al-Sharif are going there to pray for Ramadan and do not want the protests that bring on police brutality. There are many claims that these Hamas-inspired protesters are there just to incite violence. Otherwise, why are people who are going to protest bringing with them fireworks and cinder blocks? The leaders of Hamas are causing Palestinians who want to pray to end up being harmed, or to stop them from praying in order to cause chaos and get back at the Israeli government for their grievances. There have even been some suggestions that Hamas is trying to undermine Fatah, or the Palestinian Authority, by showing that they have little to no control over their people, when in reality it's Hamas-backed protesters who are causing the trouble. I see all over the internet, from celebrities to people posting these horrible images of violence on the Temple Mount, and suggesting, of course, that the Israelis are to blame for all of this, and that for some reason throwing rocks and shooting fireworks are totally a normal thing to be doing during prayer. I will definitely not be condoning any acts of violence against protesters, especially legitimate people who are going to pray. Unfortunately, police brutality happens during riots, and it is definitely wrong, and we should all hope that this would stop. However, I wonder if there's a double standard here, where the world looks on at this police action and start criticizing Israel for the horrible things they're doing to these peaceful, prayer-going Muslims on the Temple Mount, whereas if it was in their town and a bunch of people were choosing to come out of their church or their synagogue and throw rocks at police and shoot off fireworks at civilians in the area, would they expect their police services to just sit back and say, well, that's okay? Or would you right now probably expect your police services to get on their riot gear and go and try and protect their civilians and put an end to the violence? I think it is very safe to say that many of you who are listening to this would probably assume that your police services would stand up and try and protect civilians from rocks being thrown at them or fireworks being shot at them, setting fire to people's homes or even places of worship like they are in the Temple Mount. They would most likely not be criticizing the police for trying to reestablish some order and safety in the area. Of course, there are many ways to criticize the police for their actions and their methodology, for sure. However, I definitely do not see online very many people who are criticizing the supposed protesters who are acting violently, which is what brings on the violent reaction from the police. I hope those who might criticize or even see others criticize the police for trying to restore order will think how they would expect them to act if it was their city and their town being terrorized by people throwing rocks and shooting off fireworks. In the end, we see a lot of people speaking on social media about things they really don't know about, and hopefully this podcast will help you better understand some of the history behind the supposed Temple Mount status quo issues. We will also see that Hamas is sending protesters in order to not pray, but to spark conflict, because it seems like, historically speaking, the more conflict that happens, the more the Jews are restricted from visiting the Temple Mount. We also see in recent years the deterioration of the claims of the Jews to the Temple Mount. What used to be a very obvious and common sense thing, that the Temple Mount was the site of the Jewish temple at one time, is now suggesting that the Jews have no claim to this piece of land. The Jews are being restricted from visiting their holy site despite the status quo agreement, and the Palestinian people are being held captive by Hamas terrorists who are using the Temple Mount issue to harm their fellow Palestinians and Israelis in the process of getting their political gains. This is yet another example of how the Palestinian leadership is holding their own people hostage and doing more harm for the world than good. May we pray for the protection and rights of all people in Jerusalem to pray in their holy sites without any kind of discrimination or harm to come to them. May we pray for the Palestinian people to get a leadership that cares more about their people and their rights and their religion than scoring political points to try and get back at their supposed enemies, the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. If you want to engage with us on social media, at jdr.podcast, check out some of our other episodes. We'll see you next time.